Hello everyone, how are you doing? Hello everyone, how are you doing? Okay, I've just been watching a very interesting debate by Godless, and he's been doing this a lot lately. He has making the assumption that there is no God, and his argument for proving that God doesn't exist is that that why have to prove that God exists to him. However, he does not understand something called burden of proof. And how burden of proof works is that if you make a statement and claim it to be fact, then it's up to you to claim to provide evidence of it existing or being fact. Otherwise, it's classed as an opinion. Now, Godless Cranium, the Amazing Atheist, and all the other very famous atheists out there have one major flaw in their arguments, and that is they cannot prove at all that God does not exist. And when challenged to do so, they refuse. And you know why they refuse? Because they can't prove that God doesn't exist. They can prove the pantheon of God doesn't exist. You can prove that there's different pantheons of God, but they cannot prove that there is no creator as such. Now, the reason that I had to do this, I'm not a Christian, by the way. I have my own beliefs, but I thought I would put this out there because I believe that if you're going to make the assumption and make a claim that God does not exist, then you've got to back it up. You've got to prove it. Otherwise, it's an opinion. And in law, if I was going to a law, if I was defending myself in a law, in a court of law, for example, you have to forgive me, my words can be sometimes all over the place. If you're proving it in a court of law, for example, I could claim that the Amazing Atheist has a banana fetish. It would be up to me to prove that the Amazing Atheist likes shoving bananas up his backside. But and but and I would have to provide logical evidence. Now there is evidence of videos of him being linked that he has shoved bananas up his rectum, but that is not the point I'm making here. What I'm actually saying is, regardless of whether you class it as a double negative or not, is irrelevant because you are not answering your statement. You are not fulfilling the argument. You are trying to move the burden of proof on someone who is actually turning around to you and saying, prove it. And the thing is, though, if Jesus came down, you would still not believe it either, because there is a very interesting experiment that was once done, and it's called the dancing bear experiment. And the idea behind it is that you are too focused on one aspect of your life or one aspect of a picture that you don't see notifiable changes. And it's the same with what they found with why witness statements can be inaccurate, because people have blinkered vision. We've seen this in many cases. This is how witnesses have been unreliable in some cases because they can't be 100% sure of what they say. But in the case of atheism, atheism itself is an opinion and a belief. But to come factually go and say that God does not exist, you have no evidence of it. I don't have evidence there is a God, but doesn't mean that there isn't. I mean, we're going to talk about a very interesting argument that I'm going to put forward, and I'd love to know Godless Crainum and all this other response to it. And I would ask you to actually use a bit of respect for me, because I'm going to give you some respect here. I've used these valid arguments in a very civilized manner. I've only mentioned the banana thing for an example of how you have to prove something exists. You have to prove a fact before you can claim it. Anyway, so when we talk about this, there was a very famous case of a frog that had never been seen before. There was no evidence of it whatsoever, called the Pinocchio frog. No one knew it existed until it just popped onto the researcher's desk. Now, here's the question. If there was no evidence of that frog being there in the first place, does that mean until evidence was suggested that this frog didn't exist? And if not, and if it did exist, doesn't that prove that just because you can't prove something at that point in time, there's no way to physically record it through the burdens of science, then surely there is some factual evidence that maybe there is a creator, and it doesn't have to be the pantheon of gods, which is one of the biggest arguments that atheists use. There doesn't have to be like Zeus, maybe not doesn't exist, Thor doesn't exist. We are talking about God in a metaphysical sense of something created everything. We're not talking about Christian God, we're not talking about the Jewish God, pagan, Hindu. We're just talking about the concept of God, not the actual Christian or any religion concept of God. And if that is so, then all your arguments are one particular God or one particular deity. Doesn't necessarily mean that those gods, because those gods doesn't exist, doesn't mean there is a God. There are many debates, and another very interesting argument is someone says, "Oh, it's the God of the gaps." Yes, the God of the gaps, but there's the God, the science of the gaps as well. Just because you believe that science is the key, do you believe that science will solve everything? Will science 100% prove there is no God? That's it. And if so, why are people like Rupert Sheldrake coming out and providing evidence of there is more than what we think in this world? Yet you are debunking that without examining evidence. There is many different evidence out there for the paranormal. However, a lot of atheist scientists are dismissing it. Yet there is a lot of scientific processes to this. And just because, and it's the same with mediumship as well, just because you get a few dodgy mediums who are maybe famous doesn't necessarily mean that all mediums are bad. You could have, for example, a dodgy plumber. Are you going to claim that all plumbers are bad just because you had one really bad one that was conning you out money? Think about it. So that is my challenge. If they are willing to do that, you can 100% prove it. Prove that God doesn't exist. This is burden of proof. This is not about double negatives. This is why you cannot argue, because you cannot 100% prove that God does not exist. And yet your idea is to prove the otherwise. It's to say, well, your burden of proof is on us. We're not making that statement. I have not made the statement that God exists. You have made the statement yourself, in this case, that God doesn't exist. I am just giving you the counter argument here. But can you prove it? Can you prove that God doesn't exist? And this is not about double negatives, because that is just making your argument, that's just weakening your argument, because double negatives aren't a thing. We're actually saying prove that God doesn't exist, and stop moving the goalposts, because we don't know what proof you require. For all we know, God could just pick you up in the air, throw you to the other side of the world, and you think that it's just a random occurrence of science. So give us a hint, really, as well. If you want us to prove that God exists as well, tell us what you want. Tell us what evidence you want us to provide. Okay? That is all we're asking. Otherwise, you're just coming across as being arrogant, self-centered, and as one research paper actually said, that you may be borderline psychopathic. That's science, by the way. So if you can prove that God doesn't exist, and don't use this double negative argument, because it works on a statement. You have made the statement that God does not exist. You have to prove it all. In other words, put up or shut up. I'm willing to admit that if it's an opinion, if it's a personal opinion, opinions are fine. A belief system is fine. That's your statement. But if you are going around completely trashing religious YouTube channels for some selfish and arrogant reason, because you have got it in your head that you think that the world revolves around yous, I wonder. And also, people have the right to enjoy their life. And it doesn't matter what religion or belief, it won't hurt you. It's only those who said, it's only you who attack Christians. And these Christians have done nothing to you. They're not damaging you, they're not harming you. However, you have downright attacked them in some cases, held insults at them, swore at them. Even one of the very famous ones, Amazing Atheist, even condoned bullying and said those that commit suicide don't do it. Okay, thank you.